All right, so you know how you always want to get right to the core of things and understand why things are the way they are, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so today let's dive into something you brought up, which I think is fascinating. And that's why freight trains in the United States and Europe are so different.
Mm.
Like, why are they so different? We've got this article here that really digs into it, and I
Yeah.
think our mission here should be to try and pull out, like, what are the core differences?
Right.
Explore the reasons why they're different, and ultimately, like, what do these systems tell us about, like, the priorities on each continent, right?
Absolutely.
We're aiming for those, like, aha moments, like,
Yes. Yes.
yeah.
Okay, now I get it.
This is a great example of how something that seems so simple on the surface, like moving goods by rail,
Yeah.
actually reveals a lot about like broader economic and societal choices that are made.
Yeah.
And I think the article that you shared does a fantastic job of like illuminating those forks in the road.
Okay, so the first thing that jumps out, to me at least, is just the sheer scale of the U.S. system.
It's just this massive network designed to haul incredible amounts of stuff
Yeah.
across these huge distances.
Huge distances.
And the thing that sticks in my mind is like I've seen pictures of freight trains in the US that are like over 2 miles long.
It's mind-boggling.
That's longer than a lot of airports.
Yeah.
And that gives you a sense of the priority, right?
It does.
Like it's all about moving as much as possible.
It is.
And it feels like maybe that comes at the expense of things like
Uh-huh.
flexibility and integration with passenger services.
Yeah, that's such a crucial point. And this is something that I've experienced many times myself.
Sure.
I'm sure a lot of our listeners have as well. When you are sitting on an Amtrak train
Yeah.
that is just waiting for this seemingly endless freight train to go by,
Yeah.
and it's delaying your trip.
Yeah.
You know, you're like, come on, get out of the way.
More places to be.
Yeah, exactly. I've got things to do, people to see. And, it makes it really clear where the priorities lie.
Totally. And then you look at Europe and it's almost the opposite, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like they share the tracks much more evenly.
Yeah, much more integrated.
With the passenger service, it's a more integrated approach.
Absolutely. And a big part of that is because of who owns the infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? In the U.S., the rail lines and, the trains themselves are largely in the hands of private companies like BNSF,
Right.
Union Pacific. And their primary goal, understandably, is to maximize profit
Of course.
for their shareholders.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And so they want to move freight in the most efficient way possible.
Right.
But in Europe, the story is quite different.
How so?
Well, in Europe, it's mostly government entities or public authorities that own and maintain the rail infrastructure.
Okay, so that public ownership model maybe allows them to be a little bit more holistic
Exactly.
in their planning.
Much more holistic in their approach.
Sure.
And when the government controls the tracks, they can consider the needs of both freight and passenger travel in a much more integrated way.
It's not just about, moving the most tonnage in the most profitable way possible.
You're right.
There are, broader public service obligations at play.
So that fundamental difference in ownership, I feel like, really sets the stage for how the trains themselves are designed and operated.
Absolutely.
So the article describes these really long and heavy U.S. freight trains,
Yeah.
and they use this term distributed power, I think.
Yes.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So, you know how we talked about these trains being 2 miles long?
Yeah.
Well, imagine having multiple engines spread out along the length of that train,
Okay.
rather than just having one big engine at the front.
Oh.
And that helps to distribute the force that's needed to pull this incredibly heavy load.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. So you're not putting too much stress on any one point in the train or on the tracks,
Right.
and it just makes it more efficient.
Right. So in the U.S., we got these marathon runners. They're built for endurance.
Yes.
They're built for hauling huge amounts of weight.
That's right.
And then you look at Europe and it's like these sprinters,
Yes.
right? They're shorter.
They're shorter.
They're lighter.
They're lighter.
They're designed to keep to a much tighter schedule on these shared tracks.
They have to be much more agile
Yeah.
to sort of fit into this system where you have frequent passenger services.
Makes sense.
And so you can really see how those operational demands are so different depending on whether you're prioritizing, moving bulk goods across a continent
Yeah.
or sharing a very busy rail network.
Okay.
And the ownership model plays a big role in that as well.
How so?
Well, because in Europe, it's a more integrated system
Right.
on publicly owned tracks. The freight trains have to be more nimble. They have
Right.
to share the space.
Right.
Whereas in the U.S. system, the private owners can really prioritize that sheer volume.
Interesting. And then the article brings up a really interesting point about automation. It sounds like the U.S. is moving pretty quickly with things like positive train control,
Right, PTC.
which sounds like a safety feature.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But I imagine it also has implications for the size of train crews.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting because you have this tension between efficiency
Sure.
and the human element.
Okay.
So things like PTC are absolutely designed to improve safety, but by automating certain aspects of train operation,
Yeah.
it also opens the door to reducing the number of people needed to run a train.
Sure.
And in the U.S. system where you have these private companies,
Right.
the economic incentives to do that are pretty strong.
And then you look at Europe, and it sounds like they're taking a more cautious approach to automation in freight rail.
Yeah, much more cautious.
Maybe in part due to stronger labor
Yeah,
regulations
stronger labor regulation.
and that public ownership model.
And again, this goes back to the different priorities.
Okay.
So in Europe, it's not just about maximizing operational efficiency.
Yeah.
There's a real concern for job security
Right.
and the potential social consequences of widespread automation. So again, the ownership structure and these kind of broader societal values really influence how they're thinking about these technologies.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got these big long-haul trains in the U.S.
Right.
We've got this more integrated shared system in Europe.
Right.
But the article also highlights something called intermodal freight,
Yes.
which is really a strength of the U.S. system.
It is.
Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So intermodal freight is basically where you have ships, trains, and trucks all working together seamlessly.
Okay.
And you have these major hubs like Chicago
Okay.
that act as these crucial transfer points
Okay.
for goods that are moving all across the country.
So it's like these inland ports
Yes, exactly like inland
where
port.
everything's coming together and then being moved around.
Right. And because the United States is so geographically vast,
Yeah.
this intermodal approach is really, really effective.
Yeah.
And then the article contrasts that with Europe and says, there aren't as many of those long-distance intermodal rail corridors
Right.
in Europe. And I think that's partly because the distances between countries are shorter.
Okay.
And, they have a really well-developed trucking infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it might just make more sense to move things by truck
Right.
if you're going a shorter distance.
Now, we can't talk about transportation without talking about environmental impact.
Absolutely.
And the article points out that rail freight is generally more energy efficient than trucking.
Yeah, in both the U.S. and Europe.
Yeah.
Moving goods by rail produces fewer emissions per ton mile
Okay.
compared to using trucks.
Got it.
It's just a more sustainable way to move large quantities of cargo.
And maybe the U.S. has a little bit of an advantage there just
Yeah.
because of the sheer volume that they're moving by rail.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Because they're moving so much freight by rail over these long distances.
Right.
The overall reduction in emissions compared to if all that cargo was moving by truck
Yeah.
could be quite significant.
It's interesting to think about how these rail systems have these ripple effects into other areas. And the article talks a little bit about urban planning.
Yeah.
And it notes that these huge U.S. rail yards tend to be located outside of city centers.
And that makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
Because the priority is on moving that freight efficiently.
Right.
And maybe there's not as much thought given to how to integrate that rail logistics
Right.
within urban environments.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe, you might see a closer integration of rail infrastructure within cities.
Right. And then it comes back to passenger rail in the U.S., right?
Yeah, it's-
And the challenges that it faces.
Having to negotiate for track access
Yeah.
with these private freight companies.
Right. And then ending up with those delays that we were talking about.
Exactly. It's that freight first mentality and the
Yeah.
private ownership model.
Yeah.
So there's not necessarily a huge incentive for these freight companies to prioritize passenger trains
Makes sense.
because that's not their primary goal. Their primary goal is moving freight
Right.
and making a profit.
Yeah. And the article also points out these policy differences between the U.S. and Europe, where European governments are often subsidizing and supporting passenger rail,
Yes.
whereas the U.S. tends to favor private investment in freight.
Right. Less dedicated funding
Yeah.
from the government.
For passenger rail.
Exactly. And this really underscores that difference in priorities
Right.
at a governmental level.
Yeah.
European countries often see passenger rail as like a vital public service, something that's really important and that deserves a lot of government investment.
Yeah.
Whereas the U.S. has historically taken a more market-driven approach.
Right. So we've talked about all these differences.
Yeah.
And the article has this really nice analogy to kind of sum up these differences.
I like this analogy.
And it says that the U.S. is like these enormous cargo ships
Yeah.
that are designed to carry massive loads across vast oceans. And Europe is like these more agile ferry boats that are kind of sharing the waterways and making more frequent stops for passengers along the way.
I think it's a really nice visual because it really captures those contrasting priorities.
Right.
Right. The cargo ship is all about volume and efficiency over long distances.
Right.
Whereas the ferry boat is about integration and serving multiple needs within a shared network.
Okay, so the key takeaway here is that the fundamental differences in how the rail infrastructure is owned and operated, public versus private,
Public versus private.
and these differing national priorities,
Absolutely.
freight dominance in the U.S. Versus a more integrated system in Europe,
Yes.
are the core drivers behind these differences.
They really are. And it's fascinating how these foundational choices have ripple effects on everything from like the design of the trains, how they're operated, labor practices, adoption of new technologies, even how transportation planning kind of intersects with urban development.
It's all connected.
It's all connected.
So for you listening out there, think about how these differences in transportation infrastructure might shape other aspects of society and the economy in each region.
Yeah.
What are the trade-offs in each system? And ultimately, who benefits most from these very distinct approaches?
That's a great question.
It's something to ponder, isn't it?
It is.
As you go about your day.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time
See you then.
for another deep dive.
Bye.